Today's topic is going to be addiction in video games, starting off with defining and talking about addiction as a whole, and then later on going into specifically video games. Before I start, I just wanted to ask you guys if you want a separate video on my background, that including my experiences working at a behavioral health hospital, earning my master's, or my current experiences working as a registered mental health counselor intern. Let me know in the comments if you're down for that. So, let's define addiction as a whole. So I've got two websites providing different definitions, one being addiction as a whole, the other being drug addiction. So the first definition is for general addiction that says a chronic condition that can affect many aspects of your physical and mental health, relationships, and career. And it's from the Cleveland Clinic. The next one is specifically about drug addiction, and it states that it's a chronic, relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite adverse consequences. And that one's from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Nowadays, in the mental health world, we use drug use or substance use instead of abuse. So, now that we've established these two definitions, it's a condition that affects your day-to-day life. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing because you'd rather do something else, but it almost feels like you're hooked. So, there's two types of addictions. We've got substance use addictions and we've got behavioral addictions. So for substance use addictions, these include things like caffeine, alcohol, drugs, tobacco, and nicotine. These addictions have a lot of evidence behind them, evidence being research, whereas behavioral addictions kind of don't. Behavioral addictions include gaming, sex, gambling, certain websites, shopping, shoplifting, exercising and dieting, and eating. These don't really have that much research behind them, so it's a little iffy calling it straight up an addiction, especially according to the DSM, but it still shares some similarities in terms of the behaviors and consequences. It's pretty weird to see exercising and dieting, huh? I actually thought about this before I saw it on the Cleveland Clinic, that addiction could be with things that are good for you, and they turn into negatives like exercising. Let's say if you exercise all the time, what about your social life? What about your academics? What about your professional work? All those things start to go on the back burner, kind of like these other things would if you were addicted to them, because there's not a fine line, but an addiction could be also called an obsession, which goes into OCD and all that stuff. But where's the line to where it gets unhealthy, right? Because if somebody's very passionate about their work, you could call them a workaholic, which means they're addicted, right? Because now they're abandoning other things, like maybe their family, maybe their social life, etc. So what are the signs of addiction? You might be asking yourself, am I addicted to gaming? Am I addicted to this? Am I addicted to that? So the first thing is that you have a hard time stopping. Let's say if with gaming, you're playing the new shadowoftheerdtree DLC, but you got to turn in an assignment, and you're waiting, and you're waiting, and you're waiting until that very, very last minute you could start that assignment. That might be a sign. Another thing is increased tolerance. This is more for substances where you gain a tolerance, you need more in order to give you that same feeling of satisfaction. Then there's lack of control. You don't feel like you're in control, whether it's in a particular situation or maybe it's in your life in general. Maybe you're not in control when we step into the behavioral stuff, you're not in control of your finances. Maybe you're not in control of your family, your life, things like that. Next one's personal and health problems. Personal being maybe social issues, you're not talking to your family as much. Maybe you have some arguments with your partner. Then you also have health problems. One of the things that I thought of with the exercise possibly becoming an addiction is, what about people that start using steroids? I know that kind of leans into substances, but the whole goal is exercise. You love going to the gym, you love getting pumped, you love also looking good. So then you start using a substance. So it's like, it's not the substance itself that's making you feel good. It's the result of it plus working out. Because if you just use steroids and you don't work out, you're not going to look good. So let's go through possible causes from the Cleveland Clinic. So what this is supposed to show is the cycle of addiction. So first, you have the addictive behavior, whether it's on the behavior side of things, whether it's gambling, gaming, stuff like that, or you have the substance side where it includes using. Then once you do these things, it leads to your brain releasing this chemical called dopamine. I'm not going to get too much into the whole biology because I am not an expert on that at all. I just know that the chemical is called dopamine. It releases, and that's basically your brain's way of saying, ooh, I'm having pleasure from this. I'm having a reward from this. So when your brain gets that, it's temporary, very temporary pleasure and satisfaction that once your brain doesn't have it or it's not used to having it, now it craves it and it goes through withdrawals. Genetics play a big part in practically everything, especially with not only disorders, but certain behaviors. We've got mental health conditions. So certain mental health conditions could also provide addiction. Like I mentioned with OCD, sometimes we get obsessive, and if there's something we get obsessive about, it could become an addiction. We also have environmental factors, a big one being access, which includes friends and family. If our friends have it and they're using, maybe it might be easier. Same applies to behavior. If everybody you hang out with is gambling, it might be easier for you to fall into that. Traumatic events also play into a part where we might feel this escape through a certain activity or object, and that's what we start clinging on to, as opposed to dealing with that traumatic event and processing it. So how's addiction treated? There's hospitals, such as behavioral hospitals. I actually used to work at one, and I floated to the substance use department a couple times, so I don't have too much experience in it. Next is medication. So certain medications could actually replace certain substances in order to help you wean off of them. Medication could also decrease the amount of negative thoughts you might be having or low mood, and it might help boost it. There's also rehab, which includes specific facilities tailored to treating addiction. There's also therapy like cognitive behavioral therapy that could help. And there's also support groups like AA, NA, stuff like that. So let's get into the topic. Addiction and gaming. So can gaming be an addiction based on what we talked about? Absolutely. Certain games do feel rewarding and they give us a sense of pleasure, like Elden Ring. But that could be problematic when that's all we want and that's all our brain wants due to the dopamine. And that's when we start chasing it and wanting to do it again and again and again. And when we don't have it, we start getting into a low mood. We might start getting negative thoughts, anxious thoughts, and that the only thing that we seek pleasure from is this. The DSM added internet gaming disorder in 2013. I find this pretty interesting because why is it specifically only internet gaming? I don't know, but I digress. So with internet gaming disorder, it's not included with the substance use section of the DSM. The only behavioral one that's in there is gambling. So this is on another section. And it says in order to meet criteria, you need persistent and recurrent use of the internet to engage in games, often with other players, leading to clinically significant impairment or distress, as indicated by 5 or more of the following in a 12-month period. This includes preoccupation with internet games, basically only thinking about the game and nothing else. Withdrawal symptoms when internet gaming is taken away. This could include being irritable, anxious, sad, but there's no physical signs. Not like with substances. This mentions tolerance, which is the need to spend increasing amounts of time engaged in internet games. Unsuccessful attempts to control the participation in internet games. Loss of interest in previous hobbies and entertainment as a result of, and with the exception of, internet games. Continued excessive use of internet games despite knowledge of psychosocial problems. Deceiving family members, therapists, or others regarding the amount of internet gaming. Use of internet games to escape or relieve a negative mood, like helplessness, guilt, anxiety. And jeopardize or lost a significant relationship, job, or educational or career opportunity because of participation in internet games. Alright, so now that we've established the criteria, we won't go into too much about the severities and all that because this video is going to take forever. But it sounds interesting, especially the part tolerance, where the need to spend increasing amounts of time engaged in internet games, I feel like isn't a direct correlation with... Because remember, correlation does not equal causation. But I feel like with tolerance, it isn't that you play the game more and more and more, so you need more and more and more to satisfy, kind of like a substance. It might just be that you want to escape in general, not just with internet games. I know they mentioned specifically internet games, but it's interesting. Also, the fact that it's called internet games, I don't get it. Somebody could be addicted to single player games too, in my opinion. I don't know why it's specifically only internet. Here's a fun fact. Internet gaming has been defined as an addiction by the Chinese government and is considered a public health threat in South Korea, where there's even treatment and prevention systems in place. I didn't know this. There is a lack of data, though, and a lack of research specifically with internet gaming. We only have similarities, specifically behavioral similarities, between internet gaming and gambling disorder, but nothing really more than that. So the key feature in this is a pattern of excessive and prolonged participation in internet gaming that results in a cluster of cognitive and behavioral symptoms, including progressive loss of control over gaming, tolerance, and withdrawal symptoms. These behavioral symptoms, and even cognitive, include what we've talked about before, where it might be you miss out on schoolwork, you miss out on work, you miss out on spending time with friends and family, these type of things. The typical amount of time the DSM mentions that people sit in front of video games for is 8 to 10 hours or more per day, with at least 30 hours per week. Mentioning specifically that people often go for long periods of time without food or sleep, and their obligations, like I mentioned before, are neglected. So what are the risk factors? This mentions environmental, which includes just having some sort of internet connection that allows to play games. As for the genetic and physiological risk factors, it mentions that adolescent men seem to be at the greatest risk for this. Based on these 3 studies that are included in the DSM, this disorder does have some problematic effects to it, like suicidal thoughts and behavior. So for the comorbidity of this disorder, other diagnoses that are associated include MDD, or major depressive disorder, ADHD, and OCD. Now that we've talked about the gaming disorder, I don't know why it's included, I don't know why it's specifically internet gaming disorder, but let's talk about it as a whole. Because you could play a single player game 30 hours a week, right? And neglect all your obligations. So after me talking about it, what do you guys think? I didn't present this video for you to now self-diagnose. Please don't do that. That was not the goal. It's just to have a discussion and for me to provide you with this information. But to just close and wrap this all up, I do think that gaming could be an addiction, just like almost everything could. Addiction is a word that's thrown around a lot now. But for a real addiction, I think it can. I think anything could be, as long as it provides enough gratification and the person is using it mainly to escape, because that tends to drive us to want to do these things. When we get that dopamine, it's because we want it. So when we're doing something like working, going to school, we're going to have that low mood, which is going to bring us those negative thoughts and thinking, I would rather be at home gaming, I would rather be at home doing this or that, whatever it is. And it just makes the situation worse and it gets you craving and all that. So it's important to always seek help. I provided common things before, like medication, rehab, hospital, therapy, support groups. But let's say if you're going through something like this right now, I'm going to put up some hotlines here on the screen. Feel free to call one of those. If you feel like you're in an emergency or crisis right now, always call 911 or 112 for Europe. If you're in any other country or continent, make sure to call your emergency line. So that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for tuning in. And remember, if you want a video on my background, feel free to comment down below. See you guys next time.